Hi, thank you for joining us on the Odgers Berndsen One Question series. I'm Jules McKean. I run the media practice for Odgers Berndsen Executive Search out of London. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Adah Parris. Hi, Adah.
Hi, morning, Jules. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Adah is amazingly a futurist, a systems thinker, a storyteller, and an artist. She's the chair of Mental Health First Aid England. She's currently artist in 2 residences at the Design Science Studio, Buckminster Fuller Institute, and the Emergent Media Lab, the University of California, Irving. She's an enthusiastic curator of people, patterns, and stories, with a huge interest in the anatomy of transformation and innovation, from ancient wisdom, natural systems, and indigenous community practices to digital and emerging technologies. In 2020, Adah was longlisted as one of the most influential women in UK technology. And in 2019, she was recognised as one of TED Talk's global emerging innovators. And in 2018, she was recognised as one of the UK's top 100 Black and minority ethnic leaders in technology. Her clients are wide and varied, from Google to Unilever to Wayra to Playground to Burning Man. And it's never going to be enough for me to hear Adah speak. But I'm delighted that you joined us. So Adah, I'm going to throw out the question to you.
I'm ready.
Come on.
Come on, let's do this.
Anything has our industry learned from the pandemic?
Gosh, there's so many things. But when I was thinking about the question, the one word that really came up for me is intersectionality.
Right.
I think that we have had to recognize each other as human. And within that, recognizing that all of our identities are intersectional, so that we are parents and, partners and strategists and all of these different things. And I think the pandemic, what has happened is it stripped back a lot of that, all of the labels that people had. And so we were seeing, as we are now, seeing into each other's homes and realizing that, oh, this person has a life and a family and a this and all of those other things. But also, I think what I've noticed and what I'm really glad about is that people have started to recognize, and business leaders have started to recognize, that they have a bigger duty of care to their staff than they probably recognize, because of the mental health and well-being needs of people during this time.
Yeah.
So with my Mental Health First Aid England hat on, part of my remit is really getting organizations, especially business leaders, to recognize the impact that that forms of othering have had on mental health and well-being. So, for example, racism, we've seen Black Lives Matter, we've seen all of that, the Asian American, and now we've got, Israel and Palestine. And so there's this whole thing around what is the impact of that on the staff, on your people, on yourself, on mental health and well-being, and what's the role of business to look after that. But also, another thing that's really passionate for me is around menopause. Yes. And we've had Davina McCall's, show the other day, and there's been a lot of conversation. And so starting to recognize that your people have these different aspects of them that normally people have not brought into the workplace. For various reasons.
Particularly menopause, I would say. It's been the last taboo. People have not talked about it. In fact, we have a menopause allies group at work for that very reason at Odgers, which is great.
But I think that, again, like racism and diversity and inclusion, we need to keep going. We can't stop at we've got an allies group. This. I think that what I've seen and what I really want the industry to really think about is, how do we take this further? So creating a group is one thing, but the people within that group need to have power to change things, and recognize that if you recognize, as a business leader, if you recognize that you need to have a diversity group or any other, a protected characteristics group, then that is something that should be systemic in your organization. It should be systemic across your business. It shouldn't just be, well, we've got that group and we've done that now.
No, it needs to then, that group, as you say, needs to have the agency to drive real change. And I think it's useful if they know a bit about it, but then they can help.
But also recognizing that this is part of the system of the organization. It's not separate to, this is it all impacts innovation. So when people ask me about creating ethical cultures of innovation, part of it is recognizing and understanding how you weave that narrative, that understanding, that thought, the value that all of that brings into the very day-to-day operations of your business.
Have you found, Ada, because you must get asked in your various roles to help to create those sorts of cultures, and particularly with purpose at the center of them, have you noticed, and do you expect there to be an increased, impact of people living through COVID now seeking more purpose in their workplace and in what they do?
Yeah, so at the beginning, so around this time last year, I was shielding. And so as a systems thinker, I look, and a people watcher, I was looking and seeing what are the patterns that I'm seeing that are occurring out there, and what are people going to need? And there were three things I saw. The first is that the pandemic, COVID-19 does not respect human borders and boundaries. We have put those up, and we create these silos and go, right, this fits into here. If you're a strategist, you sit here and you work here. If you're a creative, you sit here and you work there. We've had these silos and ways of working, but actually what we've recognized by the very pandemic is that we need to break those borders and boundaries down in order to be able to solve problems. And I talk about creating human blockchains, which are flatter structures, decentralized systems of trust and transparency, where everybody has a part of the solution. So that's one, is that we've created the borders and boundaries, we need to break them down, and actually there's value in that, because we change the way that we recognize value. The second is that, we started to, as I said before, we started to recognize the human in each other. People saying we couldn't work from home, and now there's organizations starting to say we should be working from home more often because actually productivity is increased, not decreased. And so there's this bit about recognizing each other as human. And the last bit is that regardless of who we are, we have all gone through an existential crisis.
Yeah.
Who am I? What's important to me? What impact do I want to have in the world? And that's on the individual level. And I see that now going to the business level, where businesses are starting to say, well, should we be more activist? Activism to me is not just about going on protest marches. It's believing in something bigger than yourself and having an idea of what good or great feels like, and knowing that you could use your privilege and power and responsibility to amplify the voices and messages and lived experiences of others. And so I do feel that organizations can take a bigger stance on things such as anti-racism and menopause and mental health and well-being. So I'm working with a big national charity at the moment to help them become an anti-racist organization through a theory of change piece of work. And that is also, those conversations, even with Mental Health First Aid England, it's those conversations of how can we be big and bold and better and lead by example, and show that, that close the gap between what we're projecting externally and what's happening internally. How do we create that story?
That you've really hit the nail on the head there. It's really interesting that thought about what is being constructed as a narrative around mental health and the reality. I don't know if you found this, there's been quite a lot of, I think, companies sort of glossily producing, solutions for their teams on mental health, which basically involve them either spending more time at the office anyway by having free breakfast, or like giving them some headspace, kind of access, rather than fixing the problem. So do you ever, I imagine you have to quite often speak truth to power about, it's not enough up here, we need to systemically change the way we behave.
And it's in many ways, we saw it and recognized it as performative allyship, where with the Black Lives Matter, that there was this rush to go, right, we have an anti-racism statement, this is what we're saying on the outside, this is what we're doing. But actually, when you look beneath the surface, there was a ethnicity pay gap, or all sorts of issues. And for me, this is what we're talking about here is culture. Culture for me is about the collective stories of the people within that environment, and it should be fluid. And so what we need to do is make sure that we get organizations to close that gap, because otherwise it's purely performative allyship. You're saying that you're doing something on the outside, but internally nothing has changed. And I think that now it definitely is the time when people can't hide behind that anymore, because all the stuff that we thought was normal or was, the old way of doing things is all gone. So the rules of the game have changed, but because people have been at home and because people have gone through this existential crisis, they're also making bigger demands of their employers and saying, look, you really need to do this, otherwise we will leave.
Yes. And do you ever have to try and help leaders work out, particularly in our industry, I think, when a lot of what leaders want to help and they've really stepped forward and they've really put their arms around the team and they've been very transparent and this is where we are and this is how we're going to try and survive and it's how we're going to help our clients. Do you ever have to help them draw the line over, you're not a doctor? This is where you can construct environments around which mental health can thrive and do well, and that's your job. But actually there's a point at which you have to bring, because that's something I always observe in this, is like, that's quite challenging, isn't it?
Well, at Mental Health First Aid England, we are a social enterprise. And so what we do is we train people to become mental health first aiders.
Right.
And so they are not, and I'm trained now as a mental health first aider, and we are not therapists, we are not doctors. What we do is we are given the skills, trained in the skills to be able to recognize some of the signs of potential, of potential issues. And so what we do is we're almost the first person there to be able to provide a level of support for that person to be able to signpost them to where they need to be. So we're never there, and this is, we work with organizations to get them to train people within the organization to be mental health first aiders. Because just as, people have a first aider if somebody cuts their arm, actually going through the pandemic, or, we've talked about menopause or racism or, all sorts of things, that has a profound impact on somebody's identity. And yet we still have all people talking about bring your whole self to work, or, one of the ones that I hear a lot is we hire for fit, or, there's a cultural fit.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
It's very easy to use that terminology to then further divide.
Absolutely.
And actually, get rid of that language. Get rid of that language and
culture
help.
Add, not culture fit. Yeah. What can they add to this culture? What can they bring along that's different and additive?
But in doing that, you need to make sure that, when organizations say we're doing diversity and inclusion, or we're doing, this, I say you need to push that further, because inclusion could still be seen as tolerance if you don't create cultures where people feel like they belong. And I think that's how the conversations have been happening around getting leadership to move down in that direction.
That's so interesting, Adah, because we've talked with a couple of other leaders about how theoretically remote working could actually help drive, better inclusion in terms of being able to reach parts of the UK and find talent in parts of the UK who couldn't afford to come and live in London. And actually that sort of is quite intersectional, and it's hopefully in who it's bringing in, whether you're a kind of single mother in Leeds who's just returning to work, or you're a young person leaving university and not being able to kind of afford to live in London. But are there any fears that you've got that as we go back into kind of an office environment, we might lose some of the nice momentum that's been talked about?
I hope we don't. I really hope we don't. I think that as devastating as this pandemic has been, there are so many things to learn from it. But I think that we as individuals need to take responsibility first around recognizing the benefits that we've had from this. It hasn't all been doom and gloom and we've been locked away, that actually people have learned to slow down, to recognize that we need space to breathe, all of those different things. And so I hope that as businesses start to go back, that they also think about what were some of the valuable things that we couldn't have had in the old way of working, that we want to keep. This ability to recognize the human in each other, this ability to say, whether, an organization says we're going to use a particular mindfulness app. Okay, so whilst we're all digital, maybe it's an app, but when people start to come back into the office, what are some of the real practical, in you know, in the offline world? What are some of the things that we can do to help people? That said, I think that, you know, creating this new hybrid approach to working and to doing events and to all of these things can only widen the diversity and the potential innovation of businesses. Because to your point, if you're a single mother in Leeds that couldn't afford to come to London, but you have great talent that could be valuable, that can only be a positive for businesses.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you, Adah. And it sort of echoes what Pat Young said about the fact that when I interviewed him for this podcast, that actually not everything was great in the way it was. And let's remember we can make it better from what we've learned. So yeah. I love your idea, keeping the proper sense of the full humanity and understanding people intersectionally. That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Adah. I really hope we learn those things.
Thank you so much for having me.